Welcome to Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan. My name is Joshua, and this is episode 121, Journey to the West, Part 2. The cold winds blew through the travelers' doubled-up clothing and thick furs. Cold, wet ground meant that even 2 sets of boots were not necessarily enough after several days. The frozen mist would often obscure everything except the path immediately in front, hiding the peaks and making the sky a uniform white. In many places, the path would be blocked by rock, ice, or snow, the remnants of an avalanche, which would easily take an unsuspecting traveler. And there was the elevation. Hiking through the mountains, it was easy enough to reach the heights of a mile or higher, and for those not accustomed to that elevation, the thin air could take a surprising toll, especially if you were pushing yourself. And the road was no less kind to the animals that would be hauling said travelers and their gear. And yet this was the path that Xuanzang had agreed to. He would continue to push through despite the various deprivations that he would be subjected to. No doubt he often wondered if it was worth it. Then again, returning was just as dangerous a trip. So why not push on? Last episode, we introduced the monk Xuanzang, who traveled the Silk Road to India in the 7th century and returned to China. He brought back numerous sutras to translate and ended up founding a new school, known as the Fashang School or the Hosso School in Japan. As we mentioned last time, Xuanzang during his lifetime met with students from the archipelago when they visited the continent. The records of his travels, including his biography and travelogue, are some of the best information we have on what life was like on the Silk Road around this time. In the last episode, we talked about Xuanzang, how he set out on his travels, his illegal departure from the Tang Empire, and his perilous journey across the desert, ending up in Gaochang. There, King Chu Wentai had tried to get him to stay, but Xuanzang was determined to head out. This episode, we're going to cover his trip to Agni, Kucha, and Baluka, modern Aksu, and then up to the Western Gokturk Qaghanate's capital of Suyab. From there, we'll follow his footsteps through the Turkic-controlled regions of Transoxania and into Tukhara in modern Afghanistan. Finally, we'll cover the last parts of his journey before he reached the start of his goal, India. From Gaochang, Xuanzang continued on through the towns he names as Wuban and Dujin and into the country of Agni, known today as the area of Yanqi, which may also have been known as Wuqi. The route was well enough known, but it wasn't necessarily safe. At one point, Xuanzang's caravan met with bandits, whom they were fortunately able to pay off. The following night, they encamped on a riverbank with some merchants who also happened to be traveling the road. The merchants, though, got up at midnight and headed out, hoping to get to the city early so that they could be the first ones to the market. They only made it a few miles down the road, however, before they encountered more bandits who slaughtered them and took their goods. The following day, Xuanzang and his retinue came upon the merchants' remains lying in the road and saw the aftermath of the massacre. This was an unforgiving land, and the road was truly dangerous, even for those who traveled it regularly. And yet, Xuanzang was planning to travel its entire length until he reached India. So with little alternative, they carried on to the royal city of Agni. Agni, or Yanqi, sits on the southwestern edge of the Tarim Basin, west of Bositang Lake, on the border between the Tarim Basin and the larger Tarim Basin. The name is thought to be a Tokharian or Turfanian name for the city, which is also known as Karashur. According to the biography by Hui Li, Xuanzang and his party didn't stay long in Agni. Apparently, Agni and Gaochang were not exactly on friendly terms, and even though the king of Agni and his ministers reportedly came out to greet Xuanzang and welcome him to the city, they refused to provide any horses, and so he spent but a single night and then moved on. That said, Agni still made an impression on Xuanzang. He noted how the capital was surrounded by hills on 4 sides, making it naturally defensible. As for the people, he praises them as honest and straightforward. They wore clothing of felt and hemp cloth and cut their hair short without hats or any kind of headwear. Even the climate was pleasant, at least for the short time he was there. He also notes they used a script based on India, likely referring to the Brahmic script, which we find in the Tarim Basin. However, as for the local lord, the king of Agni, he's a little less charitable. Xuanzang claimed he was brave but lacked resourcefulness, and he was a bit of a braggart. Furthermore, the country had no guiding principles or discipline, and government orders are imperfect and not seriously implemented. He also mentioned the state of Buddhism in the country, noting that they were followers of the Sarvastivada school, a Theravada sect popular along the Silk Road at the time. Xuanzang was apparently not too pleased with the fact that they were not strict vegetarians, saying that they included in their diet the 3 kinds of pure meat. Now, from Agni, Xuanzang continued southwest, heading for the kingdom of Kucha. He seems to have bypassed the nearby kingdom of Korla, south of Agni, and headed some 60 or 70 miles, climbing up a ridge and crossing 2 large rivers, and then proceeding another 200 miles or so to the land of Kucha. Kucha was a kingdom with over 100 monasteries and 5,000 monks, following a form of Theravada Buddhism. Here, Xuanzang was welcomed in by the king, Suvarnadeva, described as having red hair and blue eyes. While Xuanzang was staying in Kucha, it is suspected that he probably visited the nearby Kizil Grotto and the Buddhist caves there, which include a painting of King Suvarnadeva's father, King Suvarnapuspa, and his 3 sons. You can still visit Kucha and the Kizil Grottos today, although getting there is quite a trek, to be sure. The ancient Kuchian capital is mostly ruins, but in the Kizil Caves, protected from the outside elements, you can find vivid paintings ranging from roughly the 4th to the 8th century, when the site was abandoned. Hundreds of caves were painted, and many still demonstrate extremely vibrant colors. The arid conditions protect them from mold and mildew, while the cave itself reduces the natural bleaching effect of sunlight. The paintings are in numerous styles and were commissioned by various individuals and groups over the years. They also give us some inkling of how vibrant the city and similar structures must have been back when the Kuchian kingdom was in its heyday. The people of Kucha are still something of a mystery. We know that at least some of them spoke an Indo-European language related to a language found in Agni, and that both of these languages are often called Tokharian, which we discussed a couple episodes back. Xuanzang himself noted that they used Indian writing, again, possibly referring to the Brahmi script, or perhaps the fact that they seem to have used Sanskrit for official purposes, such as the inscription on the cave painting at Kizil, giving the name of King Suvarnapuspa. The Kuchians also were clothed in ornamental garments of silk and embroidery. They kept their hair cut, wearing a flowing covering over their heads, and we see that in some of the paintings. Xuanzang also notes that though we may think of this area as a desert, it was a place where rice and grains, as well as fruit like grapes, pomegranates, plums, pears, peaches, and almonds were grown. Even today, modern Xinjiang grows some absolutely fantastic fruit, including grapes, which are often dried into raisins, and you can see that wherever you go. Another point of interest for Xuanzang may have been that Kucha is known as the hometown of none other than Kumarajiva. Now, we first mentioned Kumarajiva back in episode 84. Kumarajiva was one of the first people we know who translated many of the sutras from India that were more widely disseminated throughout the Yellow River and Yangtze River basins. His father was from India, and his mother was said to be a Kuchian princess. In the middle of the 4th century, when he was still quite young, he traveled to India and back with his mother on a Buddhist pilgrimage. Later, he would start a massive translation project in Chang'an, and his translations are credited with revolutionizing Chinese Buddhism. Xuanzang was initially welcomed by the king, his ministers, and the revered monk Moksagupta. They were accompanied by several thousand monks who set up tents outside the eastern gate with portable Buddha images which they worshipped, and then Xuanzang was taken to a monastery and then another monastery after that, all the way until sunset. At one of the monasteries in the southeast of the city, there were several tens of monks who originally came from Gaochang, which Xuanzang had recently visited. Since Xuanzang had come from there, they invited him to stay with them, no doubt looking for news from back home, among other things. The next day, he met and feasted with the king, politely declining any meat, and then went to the monastery in the northwest to meet with the famous monk, Moksagupta. Moksagupta himself had made the journey to India and had spent 20 years there. It seems like this would have been the perfect person for Xuanzang to talk about his plans, but instead the two butted heads. Moksagupta seems to have seen Xuanzang's Mahayana faith as heretical. He saw no reason for Xuanzang to travel all the way to India when he had all the sutras that anybody needed right there in Kucha, along with Moksagupta himself. Xuanzang's response seems to have been the Tang Dynasty Buddhist version of, "Okay, boomer," and then he went ahead and tore apart Moksagupta's understanding of his own sutras. Or so Xuanzang relayed to his biographers. We don't exactly have Moksagupta's side, and let's face it, Xuanzang and his biographers are not necessarily reliable narrators when it comes to anything having to do with Xuanzang's own prowess. After all, they followed Mahayana teachings, which they considered the greater vehicle, and they referred to the Theravada teachings as the Hinayana, or lesser vehicle. Meanwhile, Theravada Buddhists likely saw many of the Mahayana texts as extraneous, even heretical, not believing them to be actually the teachings of the Buddha. Now, it must have been winter time in Kucha, as the passes through the mountains on the road ahead were still closed. And so Xuanzang stayed in Kucha, spending his time sightseeing and meeting with various people. He even went back to see Moksagupta, but the older monk shunned him and would get up and exit the room rather than engaging with him, so they had no more conversations. Eventually, Xuanzang continued on his way west, following along the northern rim of the Tarim Basin. 2 days out from Kucha, disaster struck. Some 2,000 or so Turkish bandits suddenly appeared. I doubt Xuanzang was counting, so it may have been more or less. I imagine that memories of what had happened to the merchants near Agni must have gone through Xuanzang's mind. Fortunately for him, these bandits were fighting over the loot that they had pillaged from various travelers, and since they couldn't share it equally, they fell to fighting each other and then eventually dispersed. Xuanzang traveled for almost 200 miles after that, stopping only for a night at the kingdom of Baluka, aka Gumo. That's the modern city of Aksu in Xinjiang. This was another Theravada Buddhist kingdom. Xuanzang notes tens of Buddhist temples and over 1,000 Buddhist monks. The country wasn't large, about 200 miles east to west and 100 miles north to south. For reference, that means it was probably comparable in size with, let's say, the island of Kyushu in terms of overall area, maybe the size of Denmark, excluding Greenland, of course, or maybe the U.S. state of Maryland. Xuanzang described the country as similar to Kucha in just about every way, including the written language and law, but the spoken language was different, though we don't get many more details. From Baluka, he crossed northward through the Tianshan Mountains, which are classified as an extension of the Pamirs, known as the Ice Mountains in his account. Had he continued southwest, he would have hit Kashgar and crossed over between the Pamir and Tianshan ranges into the Fergana Valley, but instead he turned north. We don't know exactly why he took this perilous option, but that route may have been popular at the time as it was one of the most direct routes to the seat of the Western Gokturk Empire, which he was currently traveling through. The Tianshan Mountains were a dangerous journey. Avalanches could block the road, or worse. Xuanzang describes the permanent ice fields. Indeed, it is the ice fields and glaciers of the Tianshan that melt in the summer and provide the oasis towns of the Tarim Basin with water, even to this day. In Xuanzang's day, those glaciers were likely even more prevalent than today, especially as they have been recorded as rapidly disappearing since at least 1961. And where you weren't on snow and ice, the ground was probably wet and damp from the melt. To keep warm, you would wear shoes over your shoes, along with heavy fur coats, all designed to reduce exposure. Xuanzang claims that 3 or 4 of every 10 people didn't survive the crossing, and that horses and oxen, well, they fared even worse. Even if these numbers are an exaggeration, the message is clear. This was a dangerous journey. After about 7 days, Xuanzang came out of the mountains to the Great Pure Lake, or Hai, also known as the Hot Sea or the Salt Sea, which likely refers to Issyk Kul. The salt content, along with the great volume of water it possesses, means that this lake rarely freezes over, which is likely why it is seen as hot, since it doesn't freeze when the fresh water nearby does. This lake is the second largest mountain lake in the world and the second deepest saltwater lake. Traveling past the lake, Xuanzang continued to Suyab near modern Tokmak in Kyrgyzstan, just west of the modern capital of Bishkek. This was an old Sogdian settlement and had since become the capital of the Western Gokturks. Sogdians, like Xuanzang's guide Vandak, were integral to the Gokturk kingdom. Their language was the lingua franca of the Silk Road, and at the time of the Gokturk Qaghanate, it was also the official court language, and so when Xuanzang appeared at the court of the great Khagan of the Western Gokturks, it was likely the language of diplomacy. Now, when we think of Turkic people, many in the English-speaking world think of Turkey and perhaps of the mighty Ottoman Empire or something like that. Some may also think of Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, or Uzbekistan, among others. And of course, there are the Uyghur people living in Xinjiang. All of these people claim roots in the ancestral Turkic homeland in the Altai Mountains, which sits largely in western Mongolia, north of China's Xinjiang region. Much like the Xiongnu and the Mongols, they were pastoral nomads, moving their herds across the steppes, often covering great distances. They would regularly move through different regions, perhaps returning each season, though sometimes not returning for years at a time. They were often seen as barbarians by the settled people living in cities, and yet their goods and horses were highly prized. Nomad and sedentary lifestyles would often collide. Farmers would turn pasture land into fields, and when the nomadic people returned on their circuits, they would find walls and fences where there had once been open land, and the people there would claim to own the land, a concept often foreign to people who were always on the move. Nomadic people such as the Gokturks were not necessarily keeping vast libraries of written records about themselves and their histories, and so much of what we get comes from external sources, which do not always have incredibly reliable narrators. To many of the settled agriculturalists, groups like the Turks were marauders who raided their villages and farms. They were a great boogeyman of the steppes, which required the firm hand of a strong defense to keep out, or so their opponents would want people to think. While they were known for their warfare, which incorporated their mobility, they are keenly interested in trade as well. They understood the value of the trade routes and the various cities and states that they included in their empire. Thus, the Sogdians and Gokturks seem a natural fit. The Sogdians were a little more settled, but not entirely so, as demonstrated by their vast trade networks. And the Sogdians were also part of the greater Central Eurasian steppe culture, so the two cultures understood each other to a degree. They are even depicted similarly in art, with slight differences such as long hair that was often associated with Turks over Sogdians. In some areas of the Gokturk Empire, Sogdians would run the cities, while the Gokturks provided military aid and protection. Xuanzang's description of the people of Suyab, or the city of Suye River, doesn't pick out anyone in particular, and he even says that it was a place where the traders of the Hu, or foreign tribes from different countries, would mingle their abodes. He mentions the people here being called Suli, which is also the name given to the language, and I'm guessing this may refer to Sogdian in general, but I'm not entirely sure. They write with an alphabet that is written vertically rather than horizontally, which may refer to a few different scripts that were written this way, possibly based off of Syriac or Aramaic alphabets that were adapted to Sogdian and other Iranian languages. But again, it isn't entirely clear. We're told that the people dressed in felt and hemp clothing with fur and cotton garments. Their clothes fit tightly, and they kept their hair cut short, exposing the tops of their heads, though sometimes they shaved it completely, tying a colored silk band around the forehead. Xuanzang goes on to describe these people as greedy liars, possibly a reference to the mercantile nature of the many people at the time, or maybe he just didn't like them. Now, something to note, the Turks this time had not yet encountered Islam, which was just now starting to rise up in the Middle East. The Prophet Muhammad is said to have been born around the end of the 6th century CE and was preaching in the early 7th century, though his teachings would begin to spread outwards soon enough. But that means that the Gokturks were not an Islamic empire. Rather, their own tradition seems to have focused on the worship of Tengri, an Altaic personification of the universe, often simplified as a sky god. Tengrism can be found amongst the Xiongnu, Mongols, and others, and it was the national religion of the Gokturks themselves, but there were many who also adopted other religions that they encountered, including Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Manichaeism, and Buddhism. In fact, Xuanzang notes that the Turks he met in Suyab would not sleep or sit on beds made of wood because the wood was thought to contain the spirit of fire, which he says they worshipped. Now that sounds similar to Zoroastrian beliefs where fire is associated with Ahura Mazda, who's also worshipped as a sky god and often worshipped at fire temples. So these may have been beliefs inherited from their Eastern Iranian Sogdian partners, or it may have even been a misunderstanding on Xuanzang's part. In Xuanzang's biography, we are given more details about his visit to Suyab. Apparently, as he was headed to the city, he met a hunting party, which we are told was the retinue of none other than Yehu Khan. Hunting was an important part of life on the steppes, and it continued to be a favorite sport of the Gokturk nobility. Yehu Khan, possibly Yagbu Khan, though that is up for some debate, is described as being dressed in a green silk robe with his hair exposed and wearing a turban of white silk about 10 feet long that wrapped his forehead and then hung down behind his back. His hunting expedition wasn't just a couple of guys. It included 200 officials, all with plaited hair and dressed in elaborate brocade robes. They weren't exactly out there roughing it, if you know what I mean. He also had his soldiers dressed in furs, felt, or fine woolen clothes, and there were so many cavalry that they stretched out of sight. The Khan seemed pleased to meet Xuanzang, but his hunt was expected to last another couple of days at least, so he sent an attendant named Darmaja to take Xuanzang back to wait for the Khan to return. 3 days later, Xuanzang was given an audience with the returned Khan. The Khan was seated in a large yurt, or tent. Xuanzang noted the seeming incongruity between the Khan, sitting there in this tent decorated with golden flowers, with the officials dressed in magnificent brocade garments, sitting in 2 long rows in front of him, and the armed guards behind them, compared to the simple felt walls of the tent that they were all in. Now, a yurt is a common feature of nomadic life on the steppes. It wasn't exactly a single-person operation to haul them around, but they can be taken down and put up with relative ease. And while yurts could be relatively simple, there are examples of much more elaborate structures. There's little reason they couldn't be made larger, perhaps with some extra support. And in later centuries, there are examples of giant yurts that seem like real construction projects. Use of tents, even in a city where they had permanent palace buildings, was likely a means of retaining the nomadic steppe traditions, even while enjoying the benefits of city life. Now, whom exactly Xuanzang met with is a matter of debate. His records seem to indicate it was Tongyabgu Khagan of the Western Gokturk Qaghanate, but other sources say that Tongyabgu Khagan died in 628, and the earliest Xuanzang could have been meeting with him was probably 630, 2 years later. So if that is the case, he must have met with Tongyabgu's son, Siyabgu Khagan. It's likely that Xuanzang, who was dictating his accounts years after, mentioned the Khagan, and then when they looked up who it was, well, the biographers may have simply made a mistake. Remember, Xuanzang would have had everything translated through one or two languages. He did know what he saw, however, and so he presumably recounted what he remembered. Now, Tong Yabgu Khagan oversaw the height of the Gokturk Qaghanate and appears to have favored the Buddhist religion, though there were many different religions active in the territories at the time. They oversaw an extremely cosmopolitan empire covering huge swaths of Central Eurasia, including the lucrative Silk Road. Xuanzang notes that at the court, there were individuals from Gaochang and even a messenger from the Han, which is to say, from the Tang Empire. One wonders if Xuanzang, or anyone at the time, realized just how tenuous the Khan's position was. After Tang Yabgu's death, the Khaganate would decline, and less than a decade later, it would fall to the Tang dynasty, who took Suyab and made it their western outpost. In fact, Suyab is thought to have been the birthplace, over a century later, of a young boy who would find a love of poetry. That boy's name was Li Bai, or Rihaku in Japanese. He would become one of the most famous poets in Chinese history, and his poems were even known and studied in Japan. And it was largely through Japanese study of Li Bai's poem that his works came to the English-speaking world, first through Ernest Fenollosa, who had studied in Japan, and then by the celebrated Ezra Pound, who had used Ernest's notes to help him with his own translations of the poems. This was, though, as I said, over a century after Xuanzang's journey. At the time of our story, the Khagan was throwing a feast, including Xuanzang and all of the foreign envoys. Xuanzang commented on the food and drink. His host provided grape juice in lieu of wine for him and cooked him a special vegetarian feast, while the other guests ate a feast of meat, such as veal, lamb, fish, and the like. There was also music of various kinds from along the Silk Road, which Xuanzang found to be catchy, but of course, not as refined as the music he was used to, of course. After dinner, Xuanzang was apparently asked to expound upon the Dharma, and he focused largely on the basic principle that you should be kind to one another. I doubt he was getting into the deep mysteries of Buddhist philosophy here. Xuanzang stuck around the court for 3 more days, during which time the Khagan tried to get him to stay, but Xuanzang insisted he had to make it to India. And so the Khagan relented. He found men in his army who could translate for Xuanzang along his journey, and had letters of introduction written to at least as far as the state of Kapisa in modern Afghanistan. And so, armed with the Khagan's blessing and a fresh translator, Xuanzang struck out again. They headed westward for over 100 miles, eventually reaching Bingyo, aka the Thousand Springs. This is the area where the Khagan and his court would spend their summers, and the deer in the area were protected under his orders. So they were apparently not afraid of humans, which sounds similar to the situation with the deer in Nara, actually. Continuing on another 50 miles or so, and I should mention, all the distances here are approximate, as Xuanzang's primary duty was not exactly to map all this out. Well, about 50 miles or so on, Xuanzang arrived at the city of Taras in modern Kazakhstan, another place where the cultures of the Silk Road mixed and mingled. Xuanzang didn't have much to say about Taraz, apparently, though it is one of the oldest cities in Transoxania, founded near the beginning of the Common Era. A few miles south of there, Xuanzang reportedly found a village of resettled ethnic Han that had been captured by the Gokturks and settled there. They had adopted the dress and customs of the Turkic people, but continued to speak a version of Chinese. Southwest of that, he reached the city of White Water, likely referring to Aksu Kent. This is the same Aksu as the city in Xinjiang, both of which mean white water in Turkic, but this is in the south of Kazakhstan. Xuanzang found the climate and products an improvement over what he had experienced in Taraz. Beyond that, he arrived at the city of Gongnu, and then south again to Nujkend, and traveling westward to the country of Chash, aka Tashkent. Both Nujkend and Chash were large cities in nations of smaller, mostly autonomous city-states, which made up a lot of the political geography of Transoxania. I would note that Xuanzang's recollections here are much more sparse than previous. Now, this may be because these were outside of the Tarim Basin and therefore of less interest to individuals in the Tang Empire. Or perhaps he was just making his way more quickly and not stopping at every kingdom along the way. There's also the possibility that the information for these areas was outside the grasp of his biographers, so they couldn't really go ahead and fill in the blanks in the way they did elsewhere. So from Tashkent, he continued southwest to the Fergana Valley, the country of Feihan. Oddly, this country doesn't appear in Xuanzang's biography, even though the Fergana Valley seems to have been fairly well known back in the Tang Empire. I mean, it was the home of some of the best horses, which were one of its first major exports. In fact, the Han Dynasty even mounted a military expedition to travel to Fergana just to obtain horses. Xuanzang is oddly silent on all this, however, he does talk about the fertile nature of the land. He mentions that their language here is different from the lands he had been traveling through up to this point, and also points out that the people of the Fergana Valley were also visibly different from others in the area. From the Fergana Valley, Xuanzang headed west for about 300 miles, more or less to the land of Sutushana, perhaps referring to the area of Ushrusana with its capital of Bunjikat. This country was also largely Sogdian and described as similar to Tashkent or Chash. And from there he traveled west through a great desert, passing skeletons, which were the only marker of the trail other than a view of the far-off mountains. Finally, he and his companions reached Samarkand, known as the country of Kang in Chinese, which was also the term used to mark Sogdians who claimed descent from the people of Samarkand. Now, Samarkand is another of the ancient cities of Central Asia, and even today is the third largest city in modern Uzbekistan. Human activity in the region goes back to the Paleolithic era, and the city was probably founded between the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. Samarkand was conquered by Alexander the Great, and during the Achaemenid Empire, it was the capital of Sogdiana. During Xuanzang's visit, Samarkand was described as an impenetrable fortress with a large population. For all of his travel, Samarkand was the first place Xuanzang notes as specifically not a Buddhist land. In fact, there were 2 monasteries suggesting that there had been Buddhists, but if any monks tried to stay there, the locals would chase them out with fire. Instead, they worshipped fire, likely meaning Ahura Mazda and Zoroastrianism. This leads to a story that I have to wonder about given the reliability of our narrators. It is said that Xuanzang was met by the king with arrogance, but after staying the night, Xuanzang was able to tell the king about Buddhism and its merits. The king was intrigued and asked to observe the precepts, and then treated Xuanzang with hospitality and respect. So, when 2 of Xuanzang's attendants went to the monasteries to worship, and they were chased out with fire, when the king heard about this, he had the people arrested and ordered that their hands were to be cut off. Xuanzang could not bear to witness such suffering, however, and he intervened to have the assailants spared. So instead, the king had them flogged and banished from the city. Ever since then, all the people believed in Buddhism. Yay! Okay, some parts of this strike true. It was likely that the king would entertain this strange wanderer who had arrived with letters from the great Khagan, and that may have even explained why Xuanzang had been encouraged to make the dangerous journey to Suyab in the first place, so that he could obtain just such permission. And it would not be strange for the king to listen to his teachings. If Xuanzang's attendants were attacked, well, that would have been a huge breach of hospitality, and however the king felt about it, he no doubt had to do something about it. So all this sounds somewhat believable. Does that mean everyone suddenly converted to Buddhism? I don't know that I'm willing to go quite that far. It's also likely that there were Buddhists there already, even if the majority religion was Zoroastrianism. After all, they had the monasteries, right? Now from Samarkand, Xuanzang traveled farther southwest to the country of Kasana, which seems to have been the edge of what we might call Sogdiana, from what I can tell. According to his biographers, however, there was a little more to all of this than what you see in the records. Rather, according to them, he headed west to Kusanika, and then he traveled to Kargan and further on to the country of Tukhara and then Devadi. All of these were An in Chinese, which was the name element used for Sogdians from this region. From there, Xuanzang continued west to the country of Hortismica on the other side of the Amu Darya, aka the Oxus River of Transoxanian fame. And then he traveled further southwest, entering into the mountains. The path here was often such that they had to travel single file, and there was no food or water other than what you brought with you. Eventually, they came to a great set of doors, known as the Iron Gate. This was a Turkic fortress. It was no doubt fortuitous that he had come from his meeting with the Khagan and likely had permission to pass through. From there, they entered the country of Tukhara. As we noted in episode 119, Tukhara was in the region of Bactria. It was bordered by the Pamir Range in the east and the Persian Empire in the west. There were also the Great Snow Mountains in the south, likely referencing the Hindu Kush. Tukhara had been conquered by the Gokturks just within the past couple of decades, and Xuanzang notes that the country had been split into largely autonomous city-states as the local royalty had died without an heir many years before. With the Gokturk conquest, it was now administered by Taru Shad, the son of Tang Yabgu Khagan, Shad in this case being a local title. Here, Xuanzang's narrative gets a little dicey, especially between his biography and his records. The records of the western regions denotes various countries in this area, and it's unclear if he traveled to all of them or if he's just recounting them from records he obtained. He does give us at least an overview of the people and the region, and I would also note that this is one of the regions he visited again on his return trip, and so may have been more familiar with the region than those other areas he had passed through from Suyab on down. Now, for one thing, he notes that the language of the region was different from that of the Suli, which, again, appears to refer to the Sogdians, or at least all those people north up to Suyab. This was the old territory of the Kushan Empire, and they largely spoke Bactrian from what we can tell. Like Sogdian, it was another Eastern Iranian language, and they used an alphabet based largely on Greek, written horizontally rather than vertically. They also had their own coins. This region had plenty of Buddhist communities, and Xuanzang describes the cities and how many monasteries they had, though again, it isn't clear if he actually visited all of them or not. These are countries that Li Rongji translates as Timurd, Sahanian, Karun, Shuman, etc. It does seem that Xuanzang made it to the capital city, the modern city of Kunduz, Afghanistan. Xuanzang actually had something specific for the local Gokturk ruler Taru Shad. Taru Shad's wife was the younger sister of King Chu Wentai of Gaochang, whom we met last episode. Chu Wentai had provided Xuanzang a letter for his younger sister and her husband. Unfortunately, Xuanzang arrived to learn that the princess of Gaochang had passed away, and Taru Shad's own health was failing. It does seem that Taru Shad was aware of Xuanzang, however. A letter had already come from Chu Wentai to let them know that Xuanzang was on his way. As I mentioned last episode, letters were an important part of how communities stayed tied together. Of course, given the perils of the road, one assumes that multiple letters likely had to be sent just in case they didn't make it. The U.S. Postal Service, this was not. Taru Shad, though not feeling well, granted an interview with Xuanzang. He suggested that Xuanzang should stick around. Then, once the Shad had recovered from his illness, he would accompany Xuanzang personally on his trip to India. Unfortunately, this was not to be. While Xuanzang was staying there, he was witness to deadly drama. Taru Shad was recovering, which was attributed to recitations by an Indian monk who was also staying there at the time. This outcome was not exactly what Summon Court had wanted, however. One of the Shad's own sons, known as the Tagin Prince, plotted with Shad's current wife, the young Khatun, and she poisoned her husband. With the Shad dead, the throne might have gone to the son of the Gaochang princess, but he was still too young. As such, the Tagin prince was able to usurp the throne for himself, and he married his stepmother, the young Khatun. The funeral services for the late Taru Shad meant that Xuanzang was obliged to stay there for over a month. During that time, Xuanzang had a seemingly pleasant interaction with an Indian monk. And when he finally got ready to go, he asked the new Shad for a guide and horses. He agreed, but also made the suggestion that Xuanzang should then head to Balkh. While this may have been a bit of backtracking, the Shah suggested that it would be worth it, as Balkh had a flourishing Buddhist community. Fortunately, there was a group of Buddhist monks from Balkh who happened to be in Kunduz to express their condolences at the passing of Taru Shah, and they agreed to accompany Xuanzang back to their hometown, lest he end up getting lost and taking the long way there. The city of Balkh is also known as Bactria, as in Bactria, another name for the region. A settlement had been there since at least 500 BCE, and it was already an important city when it was captured by Alexander the Great. It sits at the confluence of several major trade routes, which no doubt were a big part of its success. Xuanzang's biography notes that it was a massive city, though it was relatively sparsely populated, possibly due to the relatively recent conquest by the Gokturks, which had occurred in the last couple of decades. That said, there were still thousands of monks residing at 100 monasteries in and around the city. They are all characterized as monks of Theravada schools. Southwest of the city was a monastery known as Navasamgarama, aka Navavihara or New Monastery. Despite its name, New Monastery, the monastery may have actually been much older, going back to the Kushan Emperor Kanishka in the 2nd century CE. Ruins identified as this new monastery are still visible south of Balkh today. The monastery is described as being beautifully decorated, and it seems like it had a relic, one of the Buddha's teeth. There are also various utensils that the Buddha is said to have used as well. The objects would have been displayed on festival days. North of the monastery, there was a stupa more than 200 feet in height. South of the monastery was a hermitage, and each monk who studied there and passed away would have a stupa erected for them as well. Xuanzang notes there were around 700 memorial stupas, such that they had to be crammed together base to base. It was here that Xuanzang met a young monk named Prajnakhara, who was already somewhat famous in India and pretty well studied. When questioned about certain aspects of Buddhism, Xuanzang was impressed by the monk's answers, and so stayed there a month studying with him. Eventually, Xuanzang, ready to continue his journey, departed Balkh towards the south, accompanying the teacher Prajnakhara, and together they entered the Great Snow Mountains, aka the Hindu Kush. This path was even more dangerous than the trip through the Tianshan Mountains to Suyab. They eventually left the territory of Tukhara and arrived at Bamiyan. Now, Bamiyan was a kingdom in the Hindu Kush, themselves an extension of the Himalayan mountain range, and it's largely based around a valley home to the modern city of Bamiyan, Afghanistan, which sits at the divide between Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent. Today, it is a major center for individuals of the Hazara ethnic group, one of the main ethnic groups in Afghanistan, which is a multi-ethnic state that includes today the Pashtun, Hazara, Tajik, and Uzbek people, along with a number of smaller ethnic groups. Today, they largely reside in the mountainous areas of the Hindu Kush. Bamiyan made an impact on our protagonist. Their language was slightly different from that in Tukhara, but using the same or similar enough writing system. Buddhism was thriving in the capital, and we are told of a rock statue of the standing Buddha over 100 feet in height, along with a copper statue of the standing Buddha nearby. There was also another reclining Buddha a mile or two down the road. There were multiple monasteries with thousands of monks, and the ruler of that kingdom received Xuanzang well. Now, Xuanzang wasn't the first monk to travel to Bamiyan from the Middle Kingdom. In this, he was perhaps unwittingly on the trail of the monk Fashan. Fashan likely did not see these statues, though, as we believe they were built in the 6th and early 7th century, or at least the stone Buddha statues. They were a famous worship site until February 2001, when the Taliban gave an order to destroy all the statues in Afghanistan. Despite their destruction, they were inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2003. Fortunately, we do have images from before their destruction. These statues were a blend of Greco-Buddhist and Gandharan art styles, appropriate as it stands between the Hellenistic area of Tukhara and the ancient region of Gandhara, including the modern city of Kandahar and into the Indus Valley region of Pakistan. Continuing east through the mountains, Xuanzang eventually came out at the kingdom of Kapisa. This may have had its capital around modern-day Bagram, north of Kabul, but the country seems to have been quite large. Kapisa oversaw some tens of other countries, and it is thought that at one time its influence extended from Bamiyan and Kandahar to the area of modern Jalalabad. Their language was even more different from that of Tukhara, but they were still using the same writing system. The king of Kapisa is said to have been of Suli ethnicity, which again would seem to indicate that he was Sogdian or at least descended from the people of Transoxania region. Xuanzang notes that the ruler, as rough and fiery as he is described, a true warlord or similar, he nonetheless made a silver image of the Buddha 18 feet in height every year. He also gave charity to the poor and needy in an assembly that was called every 5 years. There were over 100 monasteries and some 6,000 monks per Xuanzang's recollection, and notably, they were largely following Mahayana teachings. Now, for the most part, the monks that Xuanzang had encountered on the journey so far were Theravada. Xuanzang refers to them as Hinayana, referring to the lesser vehicle, in contrast to Xuanzang's own Mahayana or greater vehicle beliefs. Theravada refers to the way of the elders, and while Mahayana Buddhism largely accepts the sutras of Theravada Buddhism, there are many Mahayana texts that Theravada Buddhists do not believe are canonical. We discussed all this, again, back in episode 84. There was apparently a story of another individual from the Yellow River being sent as hostage to Kapisa when it was part of the Kushan Empire, under Kanishka or similar. Xuanzang recounts various places that the hostage, described as a prince, lived or visited while in that region. Xuanzang's arrival likely stirred the imagination of people who knew that the Tang were out there, but it was such a seemingly impossible distance for most people. And yet, here was someone who had traveled all across that distance. One of the monasteries that claimed to have been founded because of that ancient Han prince invited Xuanzang to stay with them. Although this one was a Theravada monastery, Xuanzang took them up on the offer, both because of the connection to someone who may or may not have been his countryman, but also because of his traveling companion, Prajnakhara, who was also a Theravada monk, and might not have been comfortable staying at a Mahayana monastery. Xuanzang spends a good deal of ink on the stories of how various monasteries and other sites were founded in Kapisa and the surrounding areas. He must have spent some time there to accumulate all of this information. It's also one of the places where he seems to have hit at least twice, once on the way to India and once on his return journey. The king of Kapisa is said to have been a devotee of Mahayana Buddhism. He invited Xuanzang and Prajnakhara to come to Mahayana Monastery to hold a Dharma gathering. There they met with several leading figures in the monastery, and they discussed different theories. This gathering lasted 5 days, and at the end the king offered Xuanzang and the other monks 5 bolts of pure brocade and various other gifts. Soon thereafter, the monk Prajnakhara was invited back to Tukhara, and so he and Xuanzang parted ways. And it was about time for Xuanzang to continue onward as well. From Kapisa, he would travel across the Black Range and into Lampaka, and that may refer to the area of Laghman or Jalalabad. Today, this is in modern Afghanistan, but for Xuanzang, this would have been the northwestern edge of India. He was almost there. And so are we, but we'll have to save his trip into India for next episode. Until then, thank you for listening. Thank you for all of your support. Remember, if you like what we're doing, please tell your friends and feel free to rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you feel the need to do more and want to help us keep this thing going, we do have information about how you can donate on Patreon or through our coffee site, ko-fi.com/Sengoku Daimyo, or find links over at our main website, sengokudaimyo.com/podcast, where we will have some more discussions on topics from this episode. Also, please feel free to reach out to our Sengoku Daimyo Facebook page. You can also email us at thesengokudaimyo@gmail.com. Thank you also to Ellen for their work editing the podcast. That's all for now. Thank you again, and I'll see you next episode on Sengoku Daimyo's Chronicles of Japan.